So today I'm here with Noah Yago. Noah is a longtime friend and the VP of Investments and Acquisition at Cisco Investments. Noah, it's so great to have you on the show today between two quarters.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. No, it's a lot of fun for me. And as you mentioned, we've been friends for a long time. I remember you trying to get me on MySpace many years ago, which was kind of a fun thing. It's amazing to see your progress as a venture capitalist since then.
Yeah, we must have been in grade school then, because clearly we're not that
Long
old.
time ago.
But
Long time ago.
we do go back a long way, and in fact, we went to high school together, and so we have a pretty strong underpinning, in New York City and in the math and science world.
Yeah, we do. And I actually think you get credit for bringing me into the venture capital industry. I was a private equity guy and a tech startup guy before that. And my first job in venture capital was with you.
That's right. And actually, I'd love to hear a little bit about, I know your story, but can you talk to me a little bit about your road to your seat today, where you're focused on both investments and acquisitions at Cisco Investments?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's a good place to start. So I've been at Cisco going on 9 years right now, and we have a team of about 40 people, and we're responsible at Cisco both for buying companies for Cisco, so it's a corporate development function, and the corporate venture capital practice as well. And I joined Cisco, came over to the corporate side after years of being in the financial side of investing, so first in private equity and then in venture capital. But I've been a venture capital investor all over the world. I've done it in Israel, done it in places like New York, and spent a lot of time in places like Germany and Los Angeles, all very different markets. And it's really sort of helped with our global thinking today. But in terms of what we do, yeah, early on, I was actually a tech guy to study computer science. And like many other people right after college, I had my dream on the entrepreneurial thing. And I launched a small startup that ran for about 4 years. Very quickly, when I had my own conversations with VCs, I came to the conclusion that I was probably a lot better suited to be on the side of the table where people are judging rather than actually building companies. And that kind of led me to being an investor. And then after years of being on the financial side of the investment side of the world, had a conversation with Cisco really after we acquired a large company in the IT operations space called App Dynamics. And my original job was to develop a thesis around investing in what we were then calling data and analytics. You fast forward a couple of years, and that was really the foundation of what a lot of people are calling AI these days. And for me, it's been sort of fun. It's as you know, in this space, you spend a lot of time going to conferences and cocktail hours. And initially, I tell people I was an investor, and they get really excited. And then I tell them I invested in data analytics, and their eyes would glaze over, and they want to hear about something else. But
I
lately,
was one of those people, and now I'm a convert.
there you go, and there you convert. Yeah, but lately, like really over the last 3 years since GPT came out, and then the whole Gen AI revolution came into play, what I've been doing and been focused on has gotten to be kind of front and center of a lot of the conversations in industry, and it's been just probably one of the most fascinating times to be in the technology market and to be doing what I'm doing. But in terms of what we do, this model, if you look at a lot of our large peers in the Valley, usually there's a distinct group that just focuses on the corporate venture capital function. And then there's another group that focuses on corp dev. And we often get asked, why are we set out that way? The simple answer is that we've been in this business for over 30 years, for decades, and we've always been set up that way. But I think there's more to it. If you think about Cisco, we're really a matrix organization. So we have a dozen or so different business units, and then we have a few different cross-functional divisions that are focused on areas like sales or finance or strategy. So when you think about bridging all those things, it makes sense for us to kind of think about each segment of the venture market and the technology market in a very different way. And then how we lead to either making a decision to acquire a company or to invest in a company really relates to what the priorities of those business units need, and then how that kind of relates to the overall thesis of Cisco. So the way that we like to think of ourselves is first and foremost, when you think about a strategy of any company, you have organic strategy, which probably comprises things like product development, how you see the
Mhm.
competitive landscape, and topics like that. But we see ourselves as really driving inorganic strategy, and then within that framework, you have the options of a very sort of simplistic form. If you're not building the technology, then you think about partnering. And then beyond partnering, you can actually make an investment in a company. And then beyond investing, if it's really a deep relationship, then you can think about acquiring a company. So what's been fun about the role that I have over here and that we have over here and this is a little bit different from being on the financial VC side, is we really have this opportunity to start off with a whiteboard and a blank sheet of paper when we think about a thesis.
Hmm.
So the way that we sort of approach the space, and we think of ourselves first and foremost as technology strategists, and what we end up doing, whether we invest in a company or acquire a company, really relates to kind of how we think about the world. So we go through this exercise where we think about what the world will look like in a couple of years and all sorts of crazy scenarios. So what if quantum's in the data center in 5 years? What if we lose access to chip manufacturing in Taiwan due to some sort of geopolitical risk? Or what happens if NVIDIA becomes the next hyperscaler? And then based on those, we try to drill down and then identify which segments of the technology market we think are interesting. We have a very iterative process where we have conversations with our business unit leaders. And only at that point do we come to the decision that we are interested in potentially investing or buying. And then the very last piece of the puzzle is when we actually develop our landscapes and reach out to companies and then take some action.
See, I think that's super interesting because you have a very unique view of the world. One, here at MVP, we have something called the MVP Galaxy, which are 35 corporate partners, corporate investors across our funds, and that's been a great source of like intelligence on what's going on, what enterprise buyers want to see. But you have this, captive group of some of the smartest technologists in the world, and smartest GMs in the world at Cisco. You're able to tap into that.
Tell me more,
When
Dan.
you
I love
think about
this. I'm
what's
a
that?
big fan of flattery. Tell me more, Dan. I'm a big fan of flattery.
That's right. Hey, flattery is great. But you also see what doesn't work, right? You see like the sort of the whiteboarding, the understanding of what is really important to like the leaders at Cisco. And you also see a lot of startups like try and sell into Cisco, either through you or probably like directly. Um, can you give us a sense of like what's worked like for startups to sort of get traction within Cisco and then maybe like after that, what really doesn't work and what sort of fails as a go-to-market strategy? Because a lot of what we talk about in between two quarters is like how startups can sell into enterprises.
Yeah, well, look, it's a really great question, and I think the answer is somewhat nuanced. So we have a massive company; it's 80 to 90,000 people, and it's like living in a small town. So oftentimes, or maybe not oftentimes, but sometimes we'll have a conversation with an entrepreneur, and they come in and they say, "Oh, well, do you know this person who works on the engineering team in your security group, or do you know that person who's in procurement?" And we often have no idea. But the way that I think it works very well is when the startup founder comes in, they really understand the buying process in an enterprise, which is very, very different. Uh, I'll give you an example. So contrasting this to my days as a financial VC, I would very frequently see companies that were going after the enterprise market, and they would try to compete solely on the basis of UI. But in doing so, they wouldn't spend as much time thinking about the value of incumbency, which means large scale existing enterprise customers, and then enterprise controls, the needs for things like access controls and then policy and governance tools. And understanding how an enterprise thinks is also vastly important. So there are different buying centers. Entrepreneurs can go in through the procurement process, which is one channel. They can go through leadership teams. So when you think about really high level engineering plays, like often it's a CIO level sale,
Mhm.
or they can take product like a PLG, a product led growth driven approach, where you really try to bubble things up from the bottom and you get people to use it, mostly with POCs, and they try to grow from there. But probably one of the biggest challenges is when people try to think about the timing of an enterprise. And if you're a small startup, the resourcing requirements to really work with an enterprise. So one example is like one of the questions that comes up commonly, like when we're going to meet with an entrepreneur, is they want to be on our price list. And a lot of
You
you
mean the
probably know
price
what
list
that
that you're
is.
quoting like in a reseller partnership, like they're working with you to be resold to other customers?
Many large enterprises, when you think about co-selling motions or
Yeah.
products that they want to sell, they want to get on basically it's a giant wish list that a large company will have that'll go to their accounts and say like, okay, you have a $10 million account with some large scale enterprise, some Fortune 100 enterprise. Here's a list of things that you want to buy. Can you buy this? And then the dream of many startups is to get on that list, and then we help sell them. There's some partnership, some joint product, something like that. It's a very hard thing to do, and it takes a long time to do. And often the pressures that you'll get from an enterprise or to do things like custom engineering to fill in a lot of features that might derail your product timeline, or you have to have things like engineering support or sales support or customer support. And a lot of 10-person companies aren't necessarily well suited for that. So when we think about the ways that we can work with a company, we can be a customer, it can be a POC. On the sort of deeper engagement, we can have design briefs together. We can
Mhm.
have joint selling motions where our sales teams are working together. And then ultimately, maybe you end up on the price list. So thinking about things in terms of the timeline that it takes to get there and the resourcing that is needed in order to sell to a large enterprise are really important, particularly if you're an early stage startup. Um, what I will say is probably one of the other big distinctions is and I'm sure you will too. You'll see a lot of startups who come in and they have a logo page where they talk about all the customers they have, and understanding the distinction between a proof of concept sale and then a much deeper sale with an enterprise is
Yes.
good. So you might be able to get some budget out of a testing budget of some sort and have a relatively low engagement with the company, which is great. It's kind of a great entry point. But what you really want is some sort of repeatable revenue stream from them with maybe a multi-year contract or something like that.
So let's dig into that because we have corporate investors that do have innovation budgets or POC budgets, and in fact, in the age of AI for the enterprise, those budgets have scaled up quite a bit. But it doesn't
Yeah.
mean that everything turns into a full contract. What have you seen work to go from proof of concept or in a pilot to like a full-on contract? Like, what do you think needs to be de-risked for a buyer? And I know there's so many
Yeah.
different buyers, so just choose one persona and like what might be de-risked that would get somebody from proof of concept to paid
Yeah.
contract.
Well, I'll give you an answer that might be unconventional. Titles within big companies matter a lot more than they do at small companies. So making sure that you have an internal champion is a very, very important thing. So we frequently see situations where early stage startups will come in, they'll work with someone who might not be as titled or maybe as well situated in the organization. And they're massive champions for the company, which is a great thing. But then they don't actually have access to the budget or they don't have connectivity to procurement, and finding someone who has visibility in terms of what that looks like and who really wants to kind of advance things. Ideally, it's someone who has a line item budget who can actually work it into their operating workflow, which would be really powerful. So I think so. What works well, like the persona, it's understand who you're talking to, understand what level of budget access they have, and try to think about what the long-term plan is and manage expectations early, and not just the plan for like what happens at the POC, but what does the process look like of engagement when you're working with a company look like over a period of quarters and potentially years?
Is there like too early to sell into? I mean, Cisco is one of the biggest companies in the world. Is there too
Yeah.
early to sell into Cisco? Would you say like, hey, if you're a Series A, seed Series A
Yeah.
company, just don't bother and just start with something in more mid-market and work your way up? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah. Another good question. So within our portfolio, we've got over 100 active portfolio companies. And with our recent efforts to have a concentrated program investing in AI, probably dozens of companies in the core AI space. We also have a portfolio development team that really focuses on getting the most out of the relationship between our portfolio companies and Cisco.
Yeah.
And what they've told us and what we found over and over is that very early stage companies, like seed stage companies, which we don't do as much of, but there's a handful, usually large scale seed stage companies that are raising enormous amounts of money,
Yes.
or Series A companies. If you don't have a dedicated account team and a team of maybe like 3 to 5 people working on the account, the relationship is sometimes a little bit premature. Uh, with the proviso being that if you have actually something that's sort of a self-serve model or product led growth, then people can use it and it's sort of lower touch and that's a bit easier. But we find the best engagement that we have with portfolio companies are when they're a bit more mature. And by best, I mean like when there's a more fluid give and take between the companies. When they're a bit more mature, they have dedicated teams that kind of run a program with Cisco or any large company, and then they can sort of advance from that perspective.
That's interesting. I've been reading a lot more about, I remember back in the day, Dropbox and Box, that became like this whole like shadow IT situation where people were like
Yeah.
individually making decisions on software because it was PLG and it got to the point where there were so many users that organizations had to make a choice about what to use. I think that's happening again with Claude and Codex It's an
Yeah.
interesting dynamic because it can be so helpful for individual productivity, but as like an organization, it can be a real challenge.
Yeah, I mean the AI space is just rewriting the rules on all of this. It's fascinating because you have probably most large enterprises. You have people clamoring. You tend to get a directive from the leadership of large organizations saying use more AI, and then from the bottoms up, you have engineers and just day-to-day practitioners. Like we in our use case, like we use it very frequently for things like deep research, right? What's a market TAM look like? What's the mix between training and inference workloads going to look like in the data center over 3 years? And what does that arc look like, right?
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic tool for that. But at some point, you need to have things like governance and responsible use within a large enterprise. And push comes to shove when you get involved with procurement or when you get involved with various governance and observability needs for these types of tools. So it's a in my view, it's likely going to look a lot like what we saw during the mobile transition, where you had large enterprises, and before MDM came out, people would try to put different tools on their own mobile devices, and then eventually they figured out a solution for that. We're not quite there yet. Right now, I'd say generally speaking, the enterprise environment seems to be a little bit more open to people trying new tools, but there's probably also a ceiling in a period of time over which people are going to have to develop enterprise controls in some degree of comfort. But there's a push pull there in that market right now. But it's certainly changing the way that software has been sold or adopted, and the demand there is seems to be uncapped.
Yeah, it really like the demand is just scaling so quickly. And like when you talk about these companies getting to 1 billion users, a lot of people are using it at work, even if it's not like even if it's more of an individual productivity tool, and not
Hmm.
necessarily mandated from the top down. One thing I wanted to get into with you is like what is also very unique, I think, about your group is that like you can invest or you can advocate for M&A. How do you decide when to go from like an investment to an acquisition? Is there, a switch that
Yeah,
flips? What's the like approach to that?
yeah. Another great question, and I'll say the
I'm full
answer
of great
is
questions.
you're full of great questions. There you go. We'll have a couple more after this, which I'm looking forward to. So we never started going back to this idea of us being very thesis driven, and we chase thesis, we chase theses, and we chase market segments and technology segments, and we don't chase transactions. Which means by the time we're actually reaching out to a company, we already have a decision in mind whether we want to acquire in a certain space or
Hmm.
to invest in a certain space. So the very last step is actually reaching out to the company. It's pretty rare that we have a conversation with a company where we have a preset notion about making an investment and that switches to an acquisition. Because what usually happens is we have conversations with our business units and our leadership, and we'll say, this area of the market is interesting to us. Usually relates to us thinking about what makes sense for us to take a position in today through an ownership process. And that could be a variety of factors. It could be trying to improve our time to market. It could be trying to bring a certain type of talent into the organization at Cisco. Or on the other extreme, if you look at some of our AI investments, let's call it like the foundation model space, I think that's pretty non-controversial. Uh, where you look at it and we say, like, look, we're not involved in that space today, but it's very important for us to learn about the market and be close to it. And investment just makes a lot of sense. So we rarely lead with the decision to make an investment or the choice rather to make an investment or an acquisition, and that tends to happen earlier in the process. What I would say though,
Do you
Dan,
then kind of
yeah,
like for acquisitions, it's more mature markets, mature product suites, and investment is more like cutting edge.
well, not necessarily. It has more to do with the adjacency to what we're doing today, what we want to do tomorrow, and then how we think about it from that perspective. So
Okay.
less about maturity. Here's a great example. We often get the question, do you invest in companies to acquire them? And the answer is we don't. It
Hmm.
does happen from time to time, though. And that begs the question, why? So if we make an investment, our goal is to make an investment to work really closely with some of the greatest portfolio companies out there, hopefully have some sort of a joint strategic vision that we can work on together, either as a customer or through a product or a sales motion or something like that. Now, if we're investing in an area that we've already identified that we care about, and then at some point down the line, this is an iterative process, by the way, meaning that we have discussions about which segments to prioritize every quarter. Sometimes we meet with our partners every week to discuss those things. But if we decide that we want to kind of shift gears and it's an area that we want to get into more deeply, like through an acquisition, who's going to be the first person we call? It's a company that you know pretty well, and if you have a great relationship, and if you built that relationship up over years through an investor portfolio relationship, the first person you're going to call is a company in your portfolio. And that's happened recently. We acquired a company called Robust Intelligence in the AI security space. So great business for us. We invested, and then it became an area that we wanted to have a more meaningful position in. And then we ultimately acquired them, and it's been great for all parties.
That's awesome. That's a really good like example of how that can play out. I do find founders oftentimes, I think, overestimate how likely it is that a strategic who invested will acquire a business. I think like the bar for buying something and all the approvals and all the support you have to get internally is really, really high. So the chance that like,
Yeah.
something from an acquisition, from an investment to an acquisition is like, fairly low, right? Like not just you, but like everyone. It's hard to do.
Yeah, it's hard to do. I mean, if you look at the numbers, just even on the investment side, this is pretty widely seen across the industry. But maybe we invest in 1% of the companies that we see over the course of a year, and we'll see sometimes well in the thousands of companies a year across our team. And then on the acquisition side, it's the number of people involved with the decision-making process is very large. It can get into the hundreds if you really add up everyone. So.
Yeah, it's like an effective outcome. It's like if you're looking at thousands of companies, you're going to invest in 1%, and of that 1% that you now have a portfolio of 100, maybe you
Yeah.
acquire single digits, and so that. But it makes sense, and I think there's a lot of other really great benefits of working with Cisco that aren't just about selling a company. It's sort of like the go-to-market, the branding, the credibility.
Yeah, we think so too.
So
We agree.
you talked about foundation models, and you can tell me what's public, but on your website,
Yeah.
it says that you invested in Anthropic and XAI, now part of SpaceX, World Labs, and Thinking Machines.
Yeah.
First of all, that's an amazing portfolio. Can you talk a little bit more? You touched on it before. Talk a little bit more about the thought process behind those investments. And
Yeah.
then I'd like to say there's the, sort of LLM, right? Like, or, in XAI and Anthropic, and then there's world models in World Labs and Thinking Machines, which are very different. But maybe talk about the thesis initially.
Yeah, the thesis. So if you look at this, so 2 years ago, we launched a dedicated program to invest solely in AI companies. And the idea here was that we wanted to be front and center in the conversations about artificial intelligence. If you look back from the time that we actually announced the program, we invested in a couple dozen companies, which is an amazing pace, but maybe not that different from a lot of other folks out there. I will say when we try to track how we're doing, like any other good company or investor relative to our peers, we believe we were probably one of the most active corporate investors in AI in the market, below NVIDIA and the hyperscalers. Maybe there's a couple of peers, but we're pretty happy with the number of companies that we've actually decided to work with. Now, when you look at all the names, maybe the first blush is, well, great, you're in a bunch of cool companies, maybe some of the most exciting companies in the space right now, right? Just, pat myself on the back, or I don't know what this move is, but it's something else. But why are you doing this, and what does that look like, and is there a strategy behind it? So the way that we think about the world is we categorize our investments really in four broad categories. So one is the foundation models. I'll go back to that and talk about why we think that's important, maybe how we're approaching that space. The second space is really the infrastructure layer. And we made investments in companies like CoreWeave and Grok, which just got acquired by NVIDIA for, I believe, $20 billion was the number that was quoted in the press. And Fabric is another really interesting one. And the third category is really in the application layer. And that's probably where you see the highest number of companies. And most of those companies are related in some form or another to security. So really, thinking about securing the new AI stack or using AI within security to address whatever threats that we're seeing in the market right now, of which there are many. And then the fourth category, this is actually a really exciting one. We call it tooling. And the thesis here is that within every technology shift, there are traditional IT and engineering problems that are going to be addressed in new ways. And we look at companies that are trying to solve those problems in an AI native context. Companies like Scale AI, so we invested in that before the Meta transaction.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting. Okay.
yeah, great New York company, Lightning, uh, is out there. It's launched by a guy named Will Falcon, who's one of the creators of PyTorch Lightning. They just did an amazing deal with a Neo cloud called Voltage Park, which is a great story if you want to read about that, but good local story. And LangChain is another one, and a few other really fantastic and kind of technically interesting companies in there. So when you think about that, our portfolio in the AI space, it kind of falls in that category. So why foundation models and how are we thinking about that? Uh, if you look at the numbers, so very basic level, everybody knows this. Foundation models are sort of front and center in every single conversation about Gen AI, and it's very important for us to be close to that. And that's supported by what we're seeing in the venture dollar allocation, where we're seeing a third, maybe even half of all venture dollars over the last year or two, depending what time period you look like, going into the foundation models. And the underlying thesis is that the entire logic layer is going to be moving to a lot of these foundation models. And we're seeing this story also play out in the public markets lately with SaaS, and you can have your views on that. We won't get into it too much, but bottom
Yeah,
line
the
is
SaaS
that,
apocalypse. It's
well,
happening.
sorry.
The
Yeah,
SaaS
well,
apocalypse is
exactly.
happening.
Yeah, we can talk about the SaaS apocalypse if we want. But the point being that the foundation models are like front and center with both driving the economics and the changing dynamics between where revenue is both spent and comes from in this market. And case in point, you see Anthropic and OpenAI headlines about their revenue where it is, but it's completely rewriting the landscape of who the leaders are in software these days, if you can
Mhm.
even still call it software. So it was important for us to do that. And our initial positions in the foundation model space were in three companies. They're in Cohere and Mistral, and then a little bit later, Anthropic. So the reason that we did that is if you think about the space, we take a global approach, by the way. So we've got offices all around the world. And our view of the AI space is that it's global, but it's also very fragmented. And the pace of AI development is very different in different parts around the world. So if you look at places like China, they're probably behind us a bit from a research perspective, but probably quite advanced when you think about applications in manufacturing and factories and things like that. And if you look at Europe, probably very focused on its industrial base, and that has some unique characteristics. And then in North America, won't talk about that too much, but I think we're ahead of the curve in terms of research and then certainly like revenue uptake and in revenue opportunities. So we took a position in Mistral, which was a European player. We came in relatively early to that one when they had something like 30 people.
Nice.
We took a position in Cohere, which had a very, at that time, very interesting approach towards embeddings models and applications in the enterprise environment. And they had a large deal with Oracle that they talked about. And then Anthropic, I think everybody knows that one really well. And it's actually played out very well to us with our goal of being close to conversations. One example of that, Mythos has been in the news a lot lately. So this new model from Anthropic
Yeah.
that everyone in the security world is worried about. And uh, Anthropic launched a project called Project Glasswing to essentially like preview Mythos with a bunch of key partners to try to think about how to kind of address the security situation early. And like we were part of that. And that came after an investment that we made early on. So not suggesting that's connected, but this whole goal of being front and center of the conversations with foundation model. It was a start with a global approach, start
Yeah.
with the goal of being in a position where we can work closely with who we think the next leaders of the space is going to be.
So, you have like a great perspective on this.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think about like the application builders, like all the companies, and we're investors in a number of them that are building, AI native solutions for specific industries on top of, one of the large foundation models. What do you think the models are? How would you think about what the models are going to do themselves and
Yeah.
where there's running room, and also how that changes, which is it changes so rapid, but like in the next couple of years?
Yeah. So what are the models going to do themselves? They can't do everything. I mean, they're fantastic tools and they're getting better every single day. So in all of these NVIDIA and AMD chips that are being shipped out today that aren't even online, like what we're seeing today and some of the revolutions that we're seeing with things like OpenClaw, which has been in the news a lot, and all sorts of other fantastic innovations. Like this is just the beginning. So uh, I don't know. How long are you and I going to have jobs? I don't know. Hopefully for a while, but we'll say. What I do think that these tools do is they provide people the ability to become a lot more productive and to handle repeatable tasks in a much more elegant and much more accelerated way. What I think it rewards in the space is individuals and companies who can apply judgment and reasoning in a way that the model still can not yet accomplish. So when you think about it from a vertical perspective, there's a massive amount of opportunity. I mean, in the legal space, there's a lot of news in the press really going back a couple of years about companies like Harvey, and you're sort of seeing that repeated in the healthcare space and pretty much any application where you think it
Yeah,
can be
like
used. Yeah,
Rogo in the financial services space, like the
yeah.
AI
Mhm.
analyst tool.
Which is great. So, sorry, tell me your question again.
Yeah,
Was
so
yeah,
my question is like where like if you're a founder and you're building in
yeah,
a vertical, like where are the models just gonna like crush you? Right? Because this is just a an
yeah,
everyday conversation. Where are they gonna crush you and where are they not gonna crush you? And it might just have to do with the size of the market. And then
yeah,
are there unlocks that create, competitive advantage for a startup? Like today,
yeah,
we're not investors in Harvey, but you brought it up, and I just read an article. They raised more capital at a really high valuation. Good for them. And they're actually not using their own fine-tuned model anymore. They're just
yeah,
using the foundation model players. So what
yeah.
have they built? I guess they built like a great workflow and great context awareness. And so I don't know. How do you think about like where there's running room for kind of vertical AI and where it's a
Yeah,
native?
I think a lot of it all comes down to company specific data and use cases, and there's been a lot of focus in the model space on post training recently.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is like in the state of the art of the technology right now, it's almost a decade old technology, the transformer technology, and you're seeing a lot of parity be reached and some degree of commoditization around core model capabilities. So when you think about things like latency and accuracy and things like that, but where there's a gap right now, and there are people like Anthropic who are kind of chasing this with vertical focused applications where they might have a specific vertical focus on financial services or healthcare or whatever it is. But company specific data and post training and understanding like specific use cases, I think is still a very interesting field. I'd be very careful when you look at repeatable tasks because I think that that's where it becomes a bit dangerous, particularly when you think about us in an agentic environment where you have the ability for agents to run in the background and complete tasks and basically mirror human workflow. The other interesting thing about it is this point about commoditization is if you think about OpenClaw as maybe a system, you have the ability to route your requests through different models and set up different agents, and you can make decisions based on ROI and costs and all these other things.
Yeah.
So the switching cost is so easy these days, and as the model capabilities become better, I would be worried about repeatable tasks, but I'd focus on uh, very finite use cases, and I would focus on use cases in which the data changes with some degree of regularity. So what I would say is it's we're in this incredibly interesting investment environment right now where you can look at a company and you can actually make a case that you can build a really interesting company that can generate cash flow with like 10 or 15 people with all the
Mm.
code tools. You can go after a specific vertical and you can actually do quite well. But the question a lot of investors are asking is what's the terminal value of that business over time? If there's some risk of the entire logic layer moving out, or if the moat's essentially clear because you need fewer engineers to create it. So
Yeah.
it all comes back down to human
Which is
judgment, is what I would say. So the
yeah.
vertical space, I think it's like short term, great for revenue generation, but a lot of thought needs to be committed to the strategy about what you want to be in a couple of years and what you want to look like. And then, maybe the last thing I'll say about it is there's this backdrop of saying, many of us, if you're watching this, you're probably front and center in a lot of conversations about AI. But there is a massive runway of companies and people who don't quite understand how to use the technology. and facilitating that ease of use of AI. I think there's still a lot of room to grow there.
I think that's really well said. I mean, I think of like use cases. I don't know. Let's just take Cisco. Like something that's vertically focused. Like you could have a company that's, in the accounting software space. AI
Yeah,
native accounting, and there's a number of those companies that are doing that. And maybe they're calling on the controller or VP of finance, in the financial org at Cisco, and so they're
yeah,
like, "Hey, we can automate a whole bunch of stuff you couldn't automate before." And I think like that org has a couple of choices. One, they can just do nothing for the time being. Two, they could hire their own devs to like build the thing, right? And maybe it's not even devs, maybe it's just like product managers who know how to like use Claude or Codex. They
hmm
could partner with Anthropic or OpenAI because they have consulting arms and they'll do it for you. So
yeah,
there's like maybe more ways that like a company can solve for like deploying AI than there used to be in these vertical use cases. And so that's what I think a
yeah,
lot about.
yeah. I think that's right. Also, we have a reference case for this, like in the form of RPA, which happened a couple years ago. So
Yes,
it
you're right.
wasn't AI, but it was maybe a precursor in terms of use cases of a lot of the functions that we're seeing, and you can see what that adoption curve looked like where it worked and where it didn't. So also, just you asked about the advice to people who are building companies. It's there's a very interesting dynamic out there right now where a lot of the interest and value in the space is really being corralled into algorithmic knowledge and technical capabilities that are close to the foundation model. Yeah, there's also a fair amount of value that can be ascribed to the system side of things and understanding like engineering, how to work with AI. But I do think the new companies that are growing, like the lion's share of interest in capital, frankly, are going to the ones where algorithmic value is front and center. By that, I mean the people who are really close to knowing how to train a foundation model or how to deal with post training or how to deal with the uh, adding additional capabilities like whether that's reasoning or understanding math or model routing or things like that.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. All right, kind of before we end, I wanted to talk about world models.
Sure. Yeah.
Find them. We've had some conversations before.
They're going to be big. They're going to
They're
be
going to
big.
be big. What's a
Yeah.
world model?
Yeah, what's the world model? Well, we got derailed with our sort of whining conversation about everything on the foundation model side of things. So we talked about our first positions, and some of our later positions. We've made investments in companies like World Labs, which is led by Fei Li, who's a legendary person in the AI space. Thinking Machines Lab is a different one. Uh, Separate thesis. We can talk about that later. But Mira Murati, the former CTO of OpenAI, started that one. Also, like a fascinating company. So within the foundation model space, when we think about world models, first of all, I should probably explain what a world model is.
Yes. What's a world model?
All right, what's a world model? So when we think about Gen AI, three phases. Phase one is text. Everybody knows what that is. Work with GPT, Claude, whatever. Ask it a question, gives you an answer. Trained on text data out there. Phase two, images. Phase three, video, and then phase four, our physical world. And oftentimes when people talk about world models, so what it is, if you go to the World Labs website, you can put a prompt in, create an office space for me on a mountain next to a beach, whatever it is, and then suddenly it'll come up with a 3D model of this environment that you create. So why is that interesting? It's extremely cool, but why is that interesting? And that's really what I want to get at. When people talk about world models, they often include it in the same sense as physical AI and robots,
Mhm.
which is interesting and exciting. And I think it's great for headlines, but I don't think it does it justice. The real reason that world models are important is because it makes everything else in AI better. So what do I mean by that? So if you think about it, easy example is you think about it for video generation or image generation. If you understand the underlying framework of the 3D dynamics behind an image and video, it makes compute less expensive. You have to spend less time computing distance between point A and point B, which means fewer cycles to figure out where to put a ball in a picture relative to a hoop, if you think about it in basketball terms. If you think about it from a reasoning perspective, if you ask it a question, if you put a prompt in saying, I threw a plate across the room, what happens to it? You're going to have fewer hallucinations if you understand the laws of physics. the plate's going to go in a certain arc, it's going to hit something, it's not going to end up on the ceiling. And so it helps with reasoning and the logic behind core text LLMs, which is also very important. And then from an application perspective, there's really a host of applications that you can use for it. The one I mentioned is probably the obvious one where you can go and create a prompt, great for interactive, but also has some massive use cases when you think about applications in autonomous environments and yeah, maybe eventually the robots.
So how do you think about world model? When I think about the progression to, you know, robotic models, if you will, it kind of sort of fit,
You mean
physical AI models,
models for robots?
models that will tell robots what to do.
Yeah.
Vision language models, right? Like sort of
Yeah.
like taking in a scene, converting it to language and instructions,
Hmm.
and actions, right? VLAs was sort of the first approach that I read a lot about for,
Yep.
programming robots. How do world models fit in with that? Is it additive?
Yeah.
Is it a replacement for the VLA approach?
So we'll talk about the world models and the robots.
Yeah.
Right. So easiest way to think about it is like simulation. If you have a world model, you can create an environment in which a robot can operate. And that's great because you can use that for training purposes and actually training the robot certain skills. Historically, robotics have been take their directions from many, many different lines of code. So the original robots that were built, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years ago, you'd have a series of if-then statements that said a robot would say, if an object comes in front of you, turn left or stop moving or whatever it is. And in today's environment, what you can do is use Gen AI to actually inform the robot's brain. So you no longer need to program the robot. The robot can learn from its environment. And generative AI is really helpful in terms of giving the robot the context to understand how it needs to operate in the world. So it allows the robot to think for itself. Not
So,
in a
and then when
Skynet creepy kind of way.
and
Hopefully we're
not
not
like
dating
well,
ourselves,
not
right?
yet, not
Yeah.
yet. But and when I think about world models, like the
Yep.
simulation is helpful in getting like reps on what might happen in the real world, so that you
Yeah.
don't have to like collect as much training data. We've actually just recently made an investment in a company that's a physical model training company called Human Archive,
Oh,
and one of the challenges in physical models or models are going to program or inform robots is that like there's not enough real world data. Getting that real world data is really difficult. A lot of real world data happens to be egocentric, so it's video data, and that's great. But when it's not combined with other types of data,
yeah.
spatial or tactile or whatever, it becomes difficult to actually like project out what's going to happen in a real world environment. So what's interesting to me is like when people talk about simulation, is there not a need for training data if the models can simulate a real world environment, or is there still need for real world training data to inform the
Oh, of
simulation?
course. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the beautiful things about world models, by the way, is it's kind of let's call it maybe a brownfield space. There's not that much 3D data out there. Like when we
Yeah.
started with text models, we were able to train all of the models off of Reddit or everything that you find on the internet and just call it for that. The world models, you actually need to create 3D images. And it's not just 3D images of what the outside looks like in a kitchen environment, how do you know that a glass is a different type of weight and texture than an apple, for example, or like squeeze a baby's hand differently than you would probably want to squeeze a I don't know, a
Yeah.
trash can handle or something like that. So so you actually need to start from a point where you actually create this data. You can get a lot of it from video, which is really helpful, but you kind of need to interpret the video to create a 3D model, which is sort of a backwards way to do it. Or you can create the 3D data yourself. Robots can help with that. I mean, you can do it with 360 cameras and a lot of other tools to create that. But to create the simulations which work, you do need this underlying data, and you need a lot of it, and it's constantly changing and at different levels of fidelity. By the way, have you seen any of these simulated robot simulations for training?
I've seen I've seen how they're collecting the training data, and it's
Yeah,
using
just go look on YouTube. All of you will really enjoy
yeah.
this. It's very weird and surreal. It's you'll see images of thousands of robots walking on top of things that look like pyramids and crashing into each other and moving. It's just oddly captivating.
Yeah, well, we're gonna have to do a lot more training and collect a lot more data if we're gonna be able to deploy robots in a safe city environment. Like even Waymo, which is amazing, is still
Yeah.
really just limited to a few core cities. We're testing them in New York right now, but I feel like it's still quite a ways away from deployment, and that's 15 years in and many billions of dollars later. So
Yeah, or
this is
you,
this,
you could probably buy a couple of these little robot dogs on off of Unitree for $1,600 if you want. It might be a good Christmas gift, Christmas gift if you're thinking
I
about
think it'd be
those.
a great Christmas gift for your kids.
Yeah,
I think I'll wait to see. I'll wait an extra year to see how that plays out before I
there we
buy it
go.
for. Well, anyway, Noah, this is awesome. The things you're doing at Cisco are like really cool. And some of these recent world model investments are like as cutting edge as it gets and as interesting as it gets. So very, very cool. Appreciate you spending some time with me.
This is fantastic and really appreciate being on here and hope everyone finds it interesting.